Welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creators, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. And you're joining us for part 2 of the discussion I had, that's Julia Golding, with Jacob Rennaker, about the nature of evil in fantasy. We're about to move from a quote by the poet Auden to look at the nature of evil in the world of Harry Potter. Auden, who also is a philosopher, he says, good can imagine evil, but evil cannot imagine good. And here we can link, I think, to the world of Harry Potter, because what you see in the sort of Voldemort world, the Death Eater world, is that they have cut themselves off to the point where they do not conceive of the value of the good. And Harry can, and others, and Dumbledore can feel what it's like to be evil. They recognize that in themselves, and they can empathize with Voldemort. When we hear about Voldemort's background, it's clear that Dumbledore feels sorry for the Tom Riddle character and his upbringing, and Harry sympathizes with Creature, the house elf, who seems very hostile. So they can imagine, and of course Creature is an enslaved house elf, so again he's a bit like an orc. He hasn't had the chance to sort of be different at that point. So I think you do get a Dark Lord in Harry Potter and he's also called the Dark Lord. But there is also the story of how the Dark Lord is made. So while Harry Potter, it does seem a bit odd that you choose to be in Slytherin and you choose to go that way if you've come from from a sort of more neutral, less evil background. You know, when you get off the train, think, oh, right, I'm going to take a real dark turn here. But yeah, there is an attempt within the way the stories are written to give more shading to how you get to be that. And it's about power, really. So I think, whereas we said that evil is sort of a moral evil that's the driver in sort of Narnia and Lord of the Rings and others. But they also share this idea that it's about taking power over others, and that's, I think, that in a non-religious context, because I don't think Harry Potter has a religious framework, is the element that's carried over into the Harry Potter world. What's your view on evil in Harry Potter?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, I think in part for plot purposes, you have evil as an external struggle where you have these clearly delineated lines where Dumbledore is explicitly referring to Voldemort as evil, that this and you can see based on their actions, right? So you have torture, right? It's like killing, torturing, certain spells are right.
Racism.
Unforgivable because they're categorically framed as evil. But within individuals, it's, again, I think you're talking about that kind of like the internal frame of reference. So is Snape an obsessive lover, or is he a hero, right? Depending on, so like what is he from his perspective, or depending on how you're seeing his story, you could see him as either one of those. How does he see himself given what he experienced? Then there's indications of both there, right? That it's not cut and dried for him. So he's a fascinating study. Dumbledore even, right? So you have him as this wise, loving figure, but sometimes he seems to be like really calculating and unemotional in some places, and just kind of like setting gears turning
and using Snape and using Harry. I
right.
think
No, exactly. Yeah. So
Snape
that's just
says he's a fattened pig or something at one stage, which is really shocking. You're just fattening him up like a pig. And I think you need that so that it's not too saccharine.
Mhm.
You've got
Yeah,
to question the good.
Right, and even for Voldemort, back to that, with Tom, Tom Riddle, like how was he raised? And I think you definitely have Harry and Tom Riddle being set as kind of
Yeah,
foils for each other, right? Both having been, disadvantaged as children without a, natural family, being raised in conditions, forced conditions of squalor or like oppression, but then seeing one chooses one way, one chooses the other way. But even then, with Tom Riddle, like how do we see Voldemort when we see him in that kind of, in between? It's as like this little, it's a baby. So is Voldemort really this like personification of evil? Like, yes, we do see that, but is he also just like a stymied little baby soul who hasn't learned how to grow up yet,
yeah,
right? That hasn't been able to grow past that kind of like infantile state of the ego and me and just like thinking of everything in terms of them. So I think we do get a glimpse of that there in Deathly Hallows, of a different way to be able to see Voldemort, while not dismissing the evils and you know I don't say genocide, but like just this kind of
yeah.
cleanly, it's a magicide uh
Yeah,
of wiping out certain individuals.
he's the
It is
psychopath
evil.
who's taken over, isn't he? Which you see that in sort of dictators, the psychopathic personality who manages to get their hooks into people and take over.
Mm,
But within Voldemort, you've got the added thing that because he's abusing magic, which is like a kind of drug equivalent,
mm,
that it starts to strip away his humanity in a real physical way within the rules of that magic world. So he
mm.
is denatured. He does become more snake-like, and
Right.
um, in a way, by the time we meet Voldemort in his adult form, I think he's much less interesting as an evil character than some of her other evil characters. So I'm particularly fond of Dolores Umbridge,
Mm.
who is a complete monster.
Right.
But
What is the
she,
sweetest character you'd ever?
yeah, I mean, I think she's just a wonderful original character, actually. And she does remind me of the Hannah Arendt. She's the philosopher who said about after the Nuremberg trials, so the banality of
Mhm.
that you can see Dolores Umbridge as that kind of bureaucratic person who's excusing bad deeds for some sort of strange logic of their own, and it's all very banal. Um, it's rules and regulations and cutting down on anything lovely or beautiful or free or self-expressive. Um, I think she's a particularly great evil character. Um,
Umbridge is good, and like kind of on the flip side of that, like the Dursleys evil? So like depending
uh,
on, right, or is it just banal, or is it that banality? Is it are these systems of power that are actually what are creating the evil itself, and individuals are either kind of like implicitly acquiescing to them, and it's the larger structural issues, like we were saying with Arendt, with Hannah Arendt, a study uh, of Nazis and how people were acting within that system. It wasn't that some of these people weren't all in on racial supremacy, but it was rather that it was within a system that they were following orders, and it was just them acquiescing to larger structures of power. And it was those larger structures of power that were the actual evil, not this kind of like active generative evil within some of those individuals who were the drivers of vehicles between death camps. So I think, yeah, so but Umbridge gives an example of somebody who's acting within a system of power, and certainly you see her kind of like personal, she's able to use that system of power to fulfill certain needs that she
yeah.
has to exercise power over individuals. That certainly fills her and actually gives her some sort of generative evil capital to be able to use within the system. Um,
I
yeah,
think
so
that
that's
the Dursleys need to be treated separately. So I think Vernon Dursley is monstrous. He's a kind of cruel stepfather figure type, almost fairy tale like. Um, no self-awareness. Um, what's her name? Not Prunella. Petunia. Petunia, that is rooted in her being scarred by seeing what's happened to her sister. So there's an element of jealousy, but there's also an element of fear. And of course, her sister is killed as a result of a magic battle. So there's obviously
Right.
scarring,
Right.
no wonder she wants nothing to do with magic. But then you've got Dudley, who actually changes. So
Mhm.
Dudley actually, if you remember, he becomes, after Harry saves him, he actually has a sort of, he's not so bad after all. So he's definitely not evil, is he? He's a bully who has learned a bit not to be a bully by the end. So he's on a more redemptive journey. But just before we leave Harry Potter, I was thinking that the way that creatures are dealt with there, that the Dementors, who are uh, external manifestations of our internal struggles and depression, I think they're fascinating. They're not exactly evil, but they are, because they don't seem to have a self. They're sort of like spirits of some sort. It's hard to classify them, but they are attracted to the evil. So they attach themselves to the Voldemort side in the same way as the wargs in Tolkien sort of attach themselves to orcs rather than being like the man's best friend in the house. They go, their nature suits them to be the tools or part of that world. So yeah, I wouldn't say that Dementors are evil though, because they are something we produce. I don't know. What do you think? I think Dementors are a brilliant
That's good.
creation.
Yeah. Yeah, because they don't, yeah, they don't, well, but that, I guess I think that goes back to that Hannah Arendt, right, kind of philosophical idea that evil exists in structures, right? So if Dementors aren't kind of this active generative evil, but they're merely complicit in the system and the system is using these for their evil ends, then by virtue of the fact that they're functioning within that and they're not opting out of it, then I guess it's kind of a tacit evil rather than something that is a more active, yeah, generative, causative evil. So yeah, that's
But you remember the Ministry of Magic are using Dementors as prison guards
right.
when they're supposedly good before the takeover. So the Ministry of, well, I don't think J.K. Rowling ever suggests the Ministry of Magic is good, because they've always had a problem with Dumbledore and others, but you can tell that they are definitely in the shades of grey area
Mhm.
morally, because they are using these incredibly unpleasant creatures in order to keep down dangerous people. I mean, I think this is the area where I find her approach to evil far more interesting and nuanced than just Voldemort himself, who, yeah, I wouldn't want to join Voldemort's team. There's no temptation for me to join his team. There's nothing, you don't get anything really, other than being a minion.
A
Um,
tattoo.
yeah, well, unless you want to be a minion. I mean, but that's another that's another conversation. So moving on from, we're not going to be able to cover all fantasy evil, but another large area which we haven't yet dealt with. So if anyone out there is thinking of how do I tackle evil, we've done the sort of um evil around power, very much exhibited in Harry Potter, but there is the fairy tale folktale evil, which belongs to all of us. And thinking of the fairy tales we tell, the sort of um Hansel and Gretel style fairy tales, evil there is often a version of criminal behavior. So Bluebeard, for example, that story is a wife abuser. Hansel and Gretel is what we would call a paedophile of sorts, or cannibal. I mean, obviously luring children with her sort of house made of sweets for nefarious purposes. They're the sort of fractures. It's like you're taking horrible human behavior, putting them through a fairy tale lens to make a story which is both a warning and something entertaining, so that we can identify the criminal behavior amongst us. Have you got a favorite evil within a fairy folktale context?
Ooh. Well, see, I don't know. What do you think of evil stepmothers as
Yeah,
across fairy tales? Like how would you see the fairy stepmother trope that appears in several fairy tales? How would you see that as
I think that
commenting on more societal evil there?
I think that links to the witch. I think it's the same figure, and the witch is um the female power that you don't like, but it's also the intergenerational, the younger model coming along, taking over from the older. I mean, there's a sort of jealousy aspect there. It's like it's lots of mirrors with reflections in fairy tales, of course. The wicked stepmother is that reflection of all the bad sides of female power, and you kind of
Mm,
separate it off rather than keeping it within one character. You put one lot over in a wicked stepmother, and being stepmother means that you don't have to own it because you're not a blood relation, and you keep all that's good and pure in your heroine, so Snow White.
mm,
And I think
right.
that's how it handle it. It's a way of I mean, they're having fun, but you can obviously see behaviors where there have been second wives who come in and abuse their children of the first marriage. So it's yeah, I think that kind of evil, because it's not referring. Having said that, there are fairy tales like within the Hans Christian Andersen world, which are religious tales. I mean, they are Christian fairy tales, but mostly in the sort of world of fairy tales as we think of it, it's outside of that kind of framework. So I feel as though it's reflecting on crime and punishment, really, because there's a lot about punishment in fairy tales.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Anyway, that's
Yes, that's for me,
probably
that's the easiest one, I think, because it does appear so much in fairy tales that that's for the frightening the image that that figure holds. I don't know what that says about me, but like holds a particularly pernicious evil there that seems so, yeah, malicious, malevolent, that is something that you're expecting. I guess, the difference between the expectations of something that might be more nurturing and that's actually turned to, in some cases, torture rather than causing to flourish, a more, yeah, like a tamping down, a just complete ruin, a grinding down, and just, I don't know if it's, yeah, the difference between the expectation and what is actually given there, that reversal that just seems to create that, yeah, the sense of like visceral evil that I think is easy for those wicked stepmothers to evoke.
yeah, and I think there's also the other strand which I came to mind when I was thinking about this is the promise that you can overcome evil. But sometimes with dubious behavior. So I'm thinking of Jack and the Beanstalk. So if you actually think about it from the point of view of the giant, Jack is a thief who comes and nicks all his best stuff and escapes and then kills him by cutting down the beanstalk. So Jack is a murderer as well. But that's not the way the tale is normally told. The giant is imagined as a sort of threat and a danger that the clever folk hero outwits and kills. It's they overcome the monster. But I think if it would be, if you're going to use this in a sort of fantasy novel context, you'd probably want to actually think about it more from the point of view of the giant these days, because that's the
Right.
more original way of looking at it. Okay, so the last area before we complete our roundup of evil in fantasy I wanted to think about was in science fiction contexts. Of course, there are many, many ways of thinking about evil, but one perennial since Frankenstein is the idea of the scientist as the overreacher. The so again, it may have a sort of Oppenheimer, I've become a destroyer of worlds religious context to it, that you're seizing too much power for yourself. Prometheus, in fact, let's go back to the Greeks, but it can be seen in a purely humanistic terms without any sort of religious or belief in anything beyond our human experience world. And that evil scientist figure is pretty prevalent. If you actually go to Frankenstein, of course, Frankenstein isn't evil. The result of what he does is evil, but he himself is not evil. It's more, yeah, and nor is the creature. So it's a very ambivalent world in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But then we get things like The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is the H.G. Wells story, which is a sort of vivisectionist, horrible scientist. Actually, H.G. Wells, of course, with his projection of the future, is also a fascinating person to think about treating of good and evil. But anyway, this evil scientist idea is definitely something you see within science fiction. Have you got a favorite evil scientist? The overreacher?
Yeah, so you mentioned two really good ones there with Dr. Moreau, who's just trying to twist creation, twist animals into something different, right? To kind of pull them unwillingly out of their kind of sphere of existence and being to make them into something else. But with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, that so it's not again like it's not that he's actively like evil doing this cackling, right? He just like he's experimenting, he wants to understand life, and he just like really this drive for knowledge to understand what is it that sparks life and allows for life to exist. He wants to unlock that. So it's this kind of this it's not quite it's Faustian in the sense that uh it's a drive for complete knowledge, unequivocal knowledge of the largest secrets of life, the universe, and everything. But it's also there. What he does afterwards is then he just runs, right? Once this life is created, he doesn't know what to do with it, doesn't want to continue to
Doesn't take
to
responsibility.
foster the
Yeah.
yeah, and so like so he's evil in the sense like his physical absence from the creature's life that he is this type of evil that there is a type of evil that will do something, set something up, create something for others, and then just leave without just abandoning all sense of responsibility, like moral responsibility for a life that you created, that leaving, and then he's just fleeing, and then the monster, but not the monster, the creature who Dr. Frankenstein sees as a monster, and who certain other people see as a monster. But one of the interesting things there is you see the creature's internal life, right?
Mm.
That they're not evil because they're just a blank slate. They were just called into existence, and then when they're interacting with this little girl in the woods, that he is, he's reading Paradise Lost. He's actually learning, growing, and he in these ways is becoming a much more moral figure than his own creator. And but then the fact that it does not is left utterly alone when the doctor has the ability to, in theory, create a companion for this creature to be able to share that kind of similar type of existence, but the doctor starts doing it. Dr. Frankenstein starts assembling it, but then decides he can't do that again, and then just like pulls it all apart and ruins it. That's when the creature turns and says, like, okay, you're going to leave me alone. You're abandoning me, and you're removing any chance I have of actual companionship in this world. My goal is to take everything you love and hold dear from you and pursue you to the end of the world, and by like taking things away from you in your life. So there's again that like evil as the absence of good, but this one is like kind of the active removal of good from the lives of other people, that you kind of see that as an evil. Not that the character was inherently evil, but that the actions that they kind of turn towards are, kind of increasing evil in that environment.
Yeah,
So
it's the sort of idea that we're tabula rasa when we're born, and then it's what's written upon us which makes us evil or good in that case. So it's the effect of the actions upon others creates the evil in that case. But on the following up the sort of the creation of the scientific version of this, the sort of overreach, which is where I was thinking about this, which is obviously our climate change, runaway climate change problem, which is evil, and we've sort of all contributed to it. I think this is an area where you can see a sort of collectivization of evil. And thinking about it in terms of sci-fi, I was thinking of there's lots of empires out there who are imagined like this. So the Borg in Star Wars, not Star Trek, sorry, Star Trek. Um, but also in Doctor Who, you've got the Daleks and the Cybermen. They both have this sort of initiation where somebody sets off this, like Davros invents the Daleks and off they go, replicating that. So you've got this idea that there's a scientific evil that sort of you get it going and it runs away. Probably when they were thinking about that, it was much more pre-climate change. It was more to do with nuclear, the arms race or something like that maybe was in the mind of people at that time. But we now have got the power to destroy ourselves many times over, cheery thought. So it's not surprising that evil's becoming associated with this sort of technological version of it. And I suppose I mentioned Star Wars. So Star Wars does have this religious aspect of the Force, which is conceived of as almost like a spirit, well, it is a spiritual force, isn't it? So it has that frame, but it does also have its Clone Wars, its Darth Vader, who's like half machine, half person. It has its mechanized version of it as well, and it sort of marries the two in that world, which I think is quite interesting. It gives more depth to the Star Wars world as a result.
yeah, Star Wars. Yeah, Star Wars is really interesting, especially when you're looking at like the evolution of the storytelling with evil and like so the Force has a dark side as well as the light side, right? So Force is what permeates, but definitely you see that there's in the original trilogy, there's a setup that the Empire is evil and aligns with the dark side of this force in some ways, but the Empire also is this structural evil that's kind of set on,
Yeah.
and when power is concentrated in a Darth Vader, in an Emperor Palpatine, that there's kind of an embodiment of evil that can be fought, but when that isn't present, like in the prequels, there's kind of a shift in how you're looking at what is evil. So it becomes really the focus is on the political system itself in the prequel trilogy, that it's not, again, it's not a character study of a hero's journey fighting an evil empire and vanquishing a head centralized evil. It's this showing how this interconnected network of individuals with different motives, most of whom want power for themselves, when these individuals want power, get in touch with each other and play off of each other, then that's creates the foundation for individuals to rise to power and then co-opt the entire system. So it is really interesting, and you see the move then in focusing on, rather than Luke Skywalker, who never is, it doesn't seem to be tempted terribly by the dark side. He seems to be, kind of like
It's
you
good.
know, good. He's good at heart, and he's taking the fight to this empire. It's kind of a David and Goliath, small wretched character who's fighting insurmountable evil and conquering it. But whereas the prequels focus on this Anakin character who, spoilers if you're not familiar with Star Wars, becomes Darth Vader. There you see this kind of internal, instead of this external struggle, it's the internal vacillation between good, evil, that you're both have it there. And then by the end of the original trilogy, then you see kind of this kind of like redemption of Darth Vader. But it's only seeing it in the context of the prequels that you really see this, yeah, again, this like vacillation, this potentiality for both good and evil, and then what circumstances that are structural, that are systemic, that allow for an individual and almost shape an individual and nudge them toward this dark side path, because he's actually doing the reason Darth Vader or Anakin kind of turns to the dark side is it was to save his wife from
Yeah, I
dying
always find that
overboard.
slightly the prequels I find quite weak in their sort of the ideas are potentially interesting, but the execution I don't
Yes, yeah.
quite go with.
I do not
So
disagree with you.
yeah. And also we're gonna have to wind up this chat now, but I can't believe we've got all the way through without talking about Gollum, because in a way the role that Darth Vader plays is a bit like Gollum, because he saves the day right at the very end, though he does
Mhm.
it through more of a repentance and seeing, whereas Gollum never does. And Gollum, of course, as is a wonderful study of those forces within us which are tearing us apart internally, and become schizophrenic in a not in the medical sense, but a two-sided personality as a result. That's what evil does. It divides us from our true self, or makes us smaller, in all sorts of ways. So, right, it's been quite a tour, and we've missed out Game of Thrones and all sorts of other things we could have touched on, and many, many more. So I apologize to you if we didn't touch on your favorite fantasy franchise. Yeah, we haven't even touched Marvel. There's so much more out there. Anyway, we're going to stop there. But I do think we should have some fun at the end, because we always have this question, or almost always, where in all the fantasy worlds is it the best to be something? And of course, today I need to ask you, where in all the fantasy worlds is it best to be a Dark Lord?
So this is going to be this might sound odd, but I would say the world, the fantasy world of Bluey,
Okay.
the cartoon cartoon dogs. And this is what. So here's why.
Okay.
So from
I'm going to have to explain this because I don't know much about this cartoon. I know it's been a big thing
oh,
with those with small children.
okay, well, I have a small child and
There you go.
it's
You're
life
outed.
changing. Yeah. So this is right. So so it's certainly a world where that it would perhaps be the Dark Lord's greatest challenge to conquer, in the sense that the individuals you would be trying to lord over would have a certain degree of I don't know, there's a sense of optimism, a sense of I don't know, like honest reckoning with one's with one's own feelings and the feelings of others. So a Dark Lord would have to, in this world, actually face their own feelings and like previous trauma, which is something that typically doesn't happen in
You
other
basically want to put your
universes.
Dark Lord through therapy. That's what you're telling
This is essentially it's essentially what you would be doing there, right? The biggest challenge that the Dark Lord has is themselves, right? That's the
me.
darkest challenge, is facing your own darkness. So to really kind of turn that on its head, instead of saying set them on a world to just like conquer and do what they their path of least resistance for a Dark Lord is pillaging, murdering, torturing.
Yeah.
That's easy. That's played out, right? What happens when you put a Dark Lord in a world that holds you accountable for your feelings and like requires you to kind of like engage with your own past, your own present, why you're feeling what you're feeling, and
Yeah.
requires you to like work through that in some way to face that. I think that would be the best place for a Dark Lord from the Dark Lord's perspective. That might not be what they think they want at the beginning, but it's really what they need
Oh, yeah.
in
That's the
today.
screenwriter's mantra. It's not what they want, it's what they need.
Right,
I think
exactly.
I've been thinking about this, and I think we didn't spend. Did we mention Milton? We should have done if we didn't. But I think I would go old school on this, that the best
Mm.
place to be a Dark Lord is to be in Milton's Paradise Lost, his version, his poetic version of the sort of Christian story, because you get such great words, and you get to be powerful, and you get to fall and raise armies, and you get great speeches. Um, so in terms of, and you get to set up everybody else's idea of what a proud Dark Lord, Byronic sort of hero is. It's anachronistic, but it all comes from that Milton Satan. So I wouldn't mind stomping around in my cloven feet and, you know, or whatever, just for that would be an imaginatively exciting place to be. So you know you're going to be defeated. That's the only depressing thing about it, because that's what you know is going to happen within that context. So I'll go into Paradise Lost. That's where I'm going. Jacob,
I endorse that fully.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your time, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.